there, and thank you so much for joining me. So are you planning on putting an enterprise architecture practice in place? Well, I've created a series of courses to help you. This is the last course in a series of 4, how to build a roadmap that leads your organization's enterprise architecture practice to maturity. So that last course, we started to create a list of activities that were needed across each of those 5 areas to move our organization's enterprise architecture maturity level from where it is today to that vision that we set out in the first course. This course, I'm going to show you how I use that information to create the consolidated roadmap for the enterprise architecture practice. This course contains a full list of activities that I always start with. I want to walk through my thought process and talk about some of the keys to making this roadmap successful. You can then adjust your list as you see fit. So my first activity is the enterprise architect. There has to be a full-time enterprise architect whose sole responsibility is this practice. The key to the success is where they report, because they cannot be perceived as either business nor IT, and they must be positioned so that they can interact with the senior executives. The practice must then start to create these enterprise architecture design principles. The creation of these will engage executives to define those innovation boundaries. This activity gives the enterprise architect the ability to interact with each of the senior executives and translates their vision for the organization. The key to success is you must include all direct reports to the CEO or CEO equivalent, and then you have to integrate all of their thoughts together. The next point is we need to start engaging with the senior executive steering committee. The ultimate goal is to become a member, but we have to start engaging with them sooner than later. So at this point, our roadmap isn't an implementation plan. This is not an order to when these activities happen. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get a list of all the activities, all the things that need to happen so that we can put an implementation plan together. And the implementation plan is really going to describe how we're going to implement each of these activities, including a timeline. Some of these activities, are pretty big, and we're going to have to break them down into manageable, implementable pieces. So I need you to keep that in mind. So we need to document our enterprise architecture assessment process. This will begin to educate the organization and you have to make sure that you get endorsement from the organization, because this really gets your buy-in. You need to work with the project management office to start updating the project charter template, because you want to start to include architectural components. What I like to do is I like to find a project that is currently running and look at how I would add some architectural components, add this section to their project charter and be able to start to show why you want to do it and the value. And you do that by giving them a real life example with a project that's on the floor. You need to create the architecture review board terms of reference. Again, you want to sort of outline its responsibilities, the key players, and what's going to happen there. And then again, get endorsement, get it published within your organization. It's just something to hold on to and to get people to understand what it is and to get that buy-in. So the full-time business architect. So you'll need the business architect skill set as soon as possible. Depending on the size of your organization, you may need a true body to help fill this. The key is the first discipline, this is the key, and it is the first discipline you really need, is you have to get those high-level consolidated roadmap together, and it always starts with your business functions. And this is a skill set that's going to start to do that for you. So you need to identify core business functions. There's usually only a handful, and getting this right it's critical. The organization must agree to them, must agree on their naming, and really must endorse the set for you. Document core business processes, including the critical success factors and KPIs. So what I mean by this is you want to start to gather the activities behind these core business functions, and you want to look at it end to end across the organization. Again, you're staying at that high level, and you're looking for those big chunky activities across the organization. And then it's key to get the critical success factors and the KPIs for each of those. The next thing would be creating the core business roadmap. So this is going to be a tool that is used to drive everything forward. You need to get it right. So looking at those core business functions that you identified, start to build out what the business roadmap will look like for those. So it's very similar to the process we're doing right now. You want to look at where they are today, where the vision is for those, and start to create the activities that are needed to move it forward. The next skill set that's really important is that information architect. If you can bring this skill set on at the same time with the business architect, especially when the business architect is documenting those core business processes, that's the best. Processes are there to collect information and move it around the organization and to deliver the service. Documenting the high-level activities from the information perspective is the easiest way to really start to identify inefficiencies and waste. Everything should revolve around this information and the key information for our decision makings. Next is to document those information aspects. So create the information roadmap related to the core business processes. So similar to the business roadmap, what you're doing is you're looking at the key information within those core business functions, and you're starting to build out a plan of where you want to get to. Again, information is all around, making sure that it is stored and protected, that it is available and accessible and usable when it needs, for the appropriate reason, appropriate time. So to build that roadmap to ensure that that information is in a position where you want it is key. So at this time, the enterprise architect would be in a position to take the first stab at this consolidated roadmap. They should have some of those processes documented from a business and information perspective, and then working with those architects, they can usually bring in technical SMEs and security SMEs around the organization to help fill in the gaps at this point and get to a place where it's a good starting point. It is so important to start showing value. So only document what you need to do that. Don't get caught up in the ivory tower and trying to make it perfect and document everything. You're going to want to start to update your project plan templates to include the ARB. So this is really, where do you want these reviews to start happening? Typically you're looking at the business architect to be reviewing business functions. You're looking for, the information architect there looking at information and data perspectives. You want the application architect there in there once you start to get into your functional designs. So you want to start adding that to your project plan templates. So I want to explain something too. It's what I mean by full-time is you need that skill set, not just working off the side of the desk. Like you need it to be recognized by the organization that this enterprise architecture practice is something that is important and that is moving forward, and individuals are given the opportunity to be doing this as part of their job. It is part of their responsibility, and it's not just off the side of the desk. So at this time now we need to start bringing in your application architect skill set. We need to start document the functional aspects of those core business processes. The key to success is to make sure you're including manual functions. It's not just about documenting what system is it using. It's more about getting into that function. Manual functions, they tend to contain a lot of risk due to manual errors and inconsistencies. And these are the things that an enterprise architect really wants to highlight and ensure that the senior executive is aware of this, and for them to make a decision if they want to reduce this risk or not. That can usually be done with an application architect working with the business and information architect. They probably don't have to go and job shadow and go through all the processes again. They can quite often determine what the functions are based on how the business and information architect documented those activities. And then we would want to start that application roadmap. So again, this really gets into mapping these functions down to applications or systems, and then looking at ways to start to build out a roadmap for how you want your application portfolio going forward. So now we want to start bringing forward the full-time technical architect. It's similar to the other disciplines. We're looking at documenting those core business processes now from a technical and infrastructure perspective. And then the security architect. Quite often, to really start to show some of the vulnerabilities and things like that, you might want to bring a security architect forward sooner than later. But they tend to always come in last, and they're not perceived as important. So I'm going to leave it up to your organization and what it would need. So the security architect, similar to the other disciplines, needs to go through those core business processes and start to really document the security aspects. Interesting with this discipline, there's security aspects related to business processes and how things are done and where they're done within the organization. There's security aspects related to the information and data. There's security aspects related to functions and systems, and then there's security aspects related to your technology and infrastructure. So they really do become the last person to overlay, because they need to touch each one of those other disciplines and add their components to it. Around now is when you should be looking at getting an enterprise architect representative on each of the projects. I found this one to be a really important one. So they're there to make sure that the roadmap and the architectural components are understood and interpreted the way that you meant it to be. They're there to make sure that this roadmap is still making sense as the project dives into details. They're there to watch for rogue work. They're there to report if there's scope creep. So again, they're not there holding the hammer, but they'll bring this information back to the architectural team so that discussions can be made and possibly escalated up to the steering committee or even the project management office. Because if the scope is, if we were not completely accurate on the scoping of the project at the beginning, maybe we need to start adjusting that so that it is successful and it comes in on time and on budget. So the architect really does have an important part there, because they're the ones at that strategic level. So they're the ones that understand that vision, because they've been in all of those meetings to build out the roadmap and what it means. They're there to make sure that strategic, fluffy conceptual information gets right down into operational, which is what happens during the projects. And they're also there because they've been in a lot of talks across the 5 disciplines. So even though they're not a business architect or don't have that skill sets, they were in a lot of the discussions where the business architect might have brought forward components that they thought were critical for this project. And they would be the ones to spark up and think, hey, maybe now I should get the business architect in talking to that area because of what I had heard. So this one is just so critical and fundamental to the success for change. Once you start getting your representatives into the projects, it's about the time that you start to hold these monthly architecture review board meetings. When I get into talking about how I'm actually going to implement this or how I implement it, I'll get into more information of what this means and how to really get this stood up so it's successful. One of the biggest things is I really started it off as more of an information meeting. So similar to what I was talking about, what the EA representatives are thinking about on the projects, those kinds of discussions can start to happen at the review boards. So even if your projects aren't really talking and you're not reviewing any of their stuff, what you could do is you could start those key conversations of what some of the discipline architects, those key points that they thought was important for the project. It's a really interesting dynamic that starts to happen when you get these conversations going, and the respect starts to build, and the organization starts to really realize the benefit of that architectural component. It is that, it's the component that starts to connect those high level dots and make things make sense. So you're able to explain why certain things are being put into a project when the project team may think it's a little bit of a waste and they don't see the value of it. So I always look at starting these reviews from that perspective. Create business standards. Once we start getting to this point, we can start to build standards. So standards are built to dictate how components are built. Only put them in place if they're needed. And what I mean by that is if you're trying to phase out applications or functions, put these standards in place so the organization doesn't forget about it. We are not creating standards just to create standards. Too many of them, everybody looks for ways to go around it. But if it's there just to remind people that we're phasing out a certain way of doing things, then, they can appreciate the value that they bring, and, they're more likely to work with you on how you can do it. The other thing I want to highlight on standards is make sure your standards aren't created and that's it in stone. They have to, like all of our roadmaps and that, they have to evolve so that they make sense. And so they continue to make sense. They're there for a purpose to help the organization. If they're no longer serving a purpose and they're no longer helping the organization, then let's look at adjusting them. So you don't want a million of them. They're too hard to control that way. And you do want to start putting them out there in each of the discipline spaces. So again, I'm not saying that business standards go first, because usually it's easier to start to create some of the technical ones, but it is an activity that's on our roadmap. So now we've got the information standards. And about this time we can start to create that technical roadmap. Again, if we start it geared more to those core processes and where the business wants to go, these kinds of roadmaps really do drive off of your business roadmap. So you're looking at those business functions, those business activities, and where they want to move, and then you're looking at how technology and infrastructure are going to support those. And that's really how these roadmaps get created. Your application roadmap is a little bit different because it needs to clean up a lot of your applications and systems at the same time. It's not solely focused at the beginning on your business roadmap. Then you've got the technical standards, so similar to the other disciplines, you're creating standards in that space. Now, this might be really late to have your full-time security architect, but again, we need one of those. And then your security architect is building out a roadmap similar to the other disciplines, and 9 times out of 10, I focus them more on the core business processes. one of the reasons I also do that is this all could be a very new concept for your organization. I mean, every organization is different, but most of the time this doesn't happen, and organizations aren't completely, they don't completely understand all the functionalities, all the responsibilities, and all the things that a security architect would do. So they kind of come along at the end, and we sort of take them on as it makes sense and as we're getting traction on the EA practice. If we were to start with this discipline, people would get confused and lose interest, and it just wouldn't make as much sense to them. But if they can see that each of the disciplines is sort of following that path, and when they start to really see the value of the business architect and the business roadmap and the business, documents, then it starts to make sense what these are. So you're creating security standards. So about this time, we're hoping to become a member of the Senior Executive Steering Committee. This is where we really want to start getting involved in all of those planning sessions. And it'll start to grow out once the organization starts to see the value of an enterprise architect at the senior executive planning sessions. They'll start to be included in more of those business planning sessions as well. The other interesting thing is if you bring the senior executives along and they're seeing the value, they're going to be the ones to dictate down to ensure that their departments are including enterprise architecture as well. So all the activities up till now really talked about those core business processes. The processes, the activities that were behind your core mission critical business functions. Once you get those documented and you get the processes and enterprise architecture activities working around those, and it's smooth and it's sort of built into the organization, excuse me, then I start to, I like to add some of the corporate business functions and processes, and do it in a similar way. Do it slowly. Start with your business and your information space, then you add your applications, your technical, and your security. So all the things we just talked about are rolled up in this one point around your corporate business processes. Then what you want to do is you want to start to incorporate those corporate business processes into all your different roadmaps. So with the exception of the application roadmap, I was suggesting that we start those business roadmaps just on those core business functions, and now you can start to incorporate more activities into your discipline roadmaps. Then we look at the supporting or the enabling business functions and processes. Those ones tend to be your IT, your idle processes. So you can start to add those in. Again, don't get down to such a level of detail that it's impossible to document and control. Control is not the right word, but document and put all this rigor around it. Look for the end-to-end process across the organization. You need to know how it fits in and how it flows across the full organization. We as architects never look at departments. We never look at the silos. We're looking at the business function and we're looking at it across the organization. That's where you get more to that strategic level. That's how you connect the dots. That's how you look for the patterns. So take a similar view when you're looking at the corporate and the enabling or supporting ones. Then you want to start incorporating those into your discipline roadmaps. Again, I'm not talking about an order to things. You might choose to do the supporting and enabling ones before your corporate ones, and it's up to you, and that will come out once we create those implementation plans. So the key to the success of all this, we don't want to waste our time doing it, but once you build that roadmap and you list all those activities, the key to success is how are you going to use it, how are you going to implement it, and then how are you going to continue to evolve it and move it forward as you go along the path to maturity. That's what's going to be the key to success for all of this. So the next step, and it's not included in this course, there is another course that is under construction that is how to implement an EA practice and the keys to success. So your next step is where I want to walk through and show you how I start to implement this. So the first step will be, how do you turn that roadmap, that long list of activities, how do you turn that into an implementation plan? How do you chunk it so you can implement it? What order? How do you choose what order to take? That's what I'm going to cover in the next series of courses. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that this was helpful. And please reach out if you have any questions or if you'd like to chat more on this topic.